Hello, I'm Dr. William Bond, and today's Bond Report is the Sunshine Act. This came through when I was in practice that I'll cover. This little government and little luck are necessary, but only a fool trusts either of them. And this is kind of this is more about a little government, although it helps to have a little luck. When Jefferson was president, he said this: history in general just informs us what bad government is. And you get a lot of that. Here we go. The history of meddlesome, intrusive government is the history of unintended consequences. You've got the headline there where prohibition's been voted in. That would be 1920. You've got the dog who's been retrieving the sticks of dynamite for you. The history of unintended consequences of well-meaning things. Churchill said that one time. It had been originally said, he was quoting Geoffrey Markin. He'd heard a sermon. He'd gone to Cardiff in Wales. He heard a sermon that was done in Welsh, but the English word truth kept coming in there. The pastor would read this in the Welsh, but then he would say the English word truth, and he said that he'd spoken to the pastor, and evidently there's no real exact word that means truth in Welsh in old time. The universities accumulate knowledge. Abbot Lawrence Lowell said this: well, the freshmen come in with a little, the seniors don't take any away, so the knowledge basically just accumulates. Some of this talks about opinions. It'll say, but the greater part of mankind has the same opinions that are in fashion. People know much, John Stuart Mill, don't feel that their opinions, they wouldn't know what to do without them, more so than anything else. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Gee, how'd that happen? So here we discuss the Sunshine Act. And we have a government thinking about this. They always thought the medical costs were too high, and they seem to be going up with the inflation rate that they unconscionably had in the 70s. Our medical costs are going up all the time, more every year. We've got to do something, and it must be somebody. All we can be sure of is this can't be legitimate. It's got to be somebody doing something shady or dishonest or illegal. Now, it couldn't be that there are a lot more effective treatments or a lot more things you can do. It couldn't be that the death rate's down and the population is larger, and furthermore, the proportion of the elderly that the Medicare budget cares for is much higher than it's been in the past. It's got to be something. It can't be mismanagement, because that would mean it was from us. So it's got to be from something illegal. It's got to be those damn doctors. And they must be overcharging. That's all we know how to do. Basically, you've got bureaucracy, and it's the sneaking belief that somebody somewhere is doing something without your permission. God knows, without your knowledge, because there's not that much knowledge. Winston Churchill said this the best: it would be hardly possible to state the opposite of the truth with more precision. That's just... So we're going to create the Sunshine Act, and we're going to stare them. And what's going to do that? The Sunshine Act is we are going to create a public website, and we are going to print out exactly the amounts that each individual doctor got that year from Medicare, so the people can know all about this and see through this. And we're going to show those doctors that are overcharging, we're going to publish what Medicare has paid them in a given calendar year. We take advice like God takes advice. We answer questions like God does. This is what we're going to do. And so this is when I was in practice, if you take and examine their underlying assumptions, and remember who puts these things into place, it's a bunch of bureaucrats and lawyers. And they tend to have they'll flog certain opinions. Well, it must be this Edsel, 1959, everybody thinks, nobody actually thought, but everybody thinks that looks good. Why don't you get with the program? 1959 will prove it. 1959 proves something else. But here we are with our opinions, that they're all overcharging, this has got to be illegal. So they assume, like everybody does, that everyone functions in the same manner that they do. The people are more or less the same. If you've never had a job, that jobs are all more or less the same. They assume that any payment to anyone else by anyone must be done in some kind of sinister or corrupt manner. Therefore, if you publish that information, that's damaging to them and the person paying them off. Gee, they get their salary every month, so any extra that they'd consider extra money has got to be coming from something that's shady or illegal. They're just following their own experience. So the core assumption is this outside influence. It needs to be hidden because these guys are going to be embarrassed about it. So since they do business that way, their core assumption is if we do it, so must everyone else. So here's your model of influence. The guy putting his hand back, taking the money. There's got to be something shady going on. This is straight out of Orwell in the way they'll choose to do it. This is going to be a bureaucracy where no one's ever had a real job. It'll have some teeth in it. We'll have some secret police. We'll make some aggressive assumptions. But actually, we'll have overweening government. It'll be straight out of Orwell. Actually, there are companies that are private companies that'll actually set up to help you with this, to otherwise regulation. And there are some companies that set themselves up, and is this a great country or what? You've got this threat of this thing. They're going to set up to handle these presumed troubles for you. And I remember getting this, the Sunshine Act, nothing's ever happened with that yet. And you wanted to say, this is when Jeopardy was big. I'll take things that make you say, come on, for 400, Alex. And I thought that was very witty at the time. This is one of my favorite quotes. My client would like to deeply apologize for what may or may not have happened. Nothing's happened yet. Nothing's going on, but we're sure sorry about what may or may not have happened. But evidently, we're going to publish these sums, and they've got to be shady. The guys must not want this published. You're supposed to be compromised or damaged, or at the very least embarrassed by what Medicare is paying you that year. What if you're not? And we're going to have our example. There's a picture. That was Virginia Hill, is her name. And I'll go on from there. The Kefauver hearings were in 1956. This is a senator from Kentucky, Estes Kefauver. And he had hearings that were very famous at the time into organized crime. This gentleman is Frank Costello. And he dressed nicely, but he was made to look at the Kefauver hearings, which were televised on live television, like the scary hood that he in fact was. And he, in fact, is a prototype for a lot of the way hoods act on television, is they watch Frank Costello. He was the poster child for that. But now we have Virginia Hill is going to come on the Kefauver hearings. She was with, at the time, and much later, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the guy who got Las Vegas going, who was a New York hood. Him and his friend Meyer Lansky were Jewish gentlemen, and they were accomplished gangsters. And he was called Bugsy. It meant crazy at the time, Bugs Bunny, Bugs Moran. It's not a compliment. It was meant to imply crazy by a bunch of scary guys thought he was crazy. And in fact, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel didn't like to be called that. He didn't like the implications of that and was the opposite of fond of being called that. Now, interestingly, Virginia Hill, when he was murdered by a guy with sniper shot, he was at Virginia Hill's house. That was done in a room that looked out the window. The Flamingo is what she was called. She happened to have long legs. She was thought to have a long neck. It didn't show in that picture. And her name was Flamingo. So when Mr. Siegel built the hotel, the first one along the Strip in Las Vegas, it was called Flamingo. And that was from Virginia Hill. That's Virginia Hill's name. So that's the Flamingo. Everybody knew that. I find this interesting. The lounge in there that they have now is called Bugsy's. And it's part of the, inside knowledge. This was Bugsy Siegel's hotel. Bugsy Siegel, the guy who started that hotel, would totally turn over in his grave if he knew that lounge was called Bugsy. He didn't like to be called that at all. And it was known to have killed a guy or two over that. So here he is. They did this in the movie Bugsy, where Warren Beatty played him. There was some reporter who hadn't been told that, who yelled out his name to ask him some question. And there's, people all around, a bunch of witnesses, a bunch of everything. And Siegel actually turned around and said, were you talking to me? What did you call me? Oh, is that? Well, he called him Bugsy. That's what you heard, huh? Well, see, a bug is a so-and-so. A bug is an insect. A bug is a so-and-so. See, if you were talking to me, my name's Benjamin, like in the Bible. And this is an interesting thing. So We meet Virginia Hill. Virginia Hill comes up to the Kefauver hearings, and they're going to embarrass her, and they get some senator, and I don't remember the details of this, but one of these Cleghorn accents that they've got, well, they're going to embarrass Virginia Hill. Well, why is it that you think that Mr. Siegel would call a hotel after you? They're going to embarrass her, and they're going to do that, and so they're building up to that. And the reason there is a tape delay on live microphones now that they routinely do on television can largely be traced back to Virginia Hill. This is 1956 black and white TV beamed into the homes of Americans everywhere live. Most of TV was live then. But here's Virginia Hill. Why do you think that was all happening? There's no tape delay or no anything. It came into being after that, largely because of that. And she looked into the camera and said, well, Senator, that has to be because at that time I was considered entirely the best lay on the entire West Coast. And then she went into a great deal of detail about how she had acquired the reputation. And in fact, she was pretty sure it was absolutely true that she was the best lay on the West Coast, and went into detail and description and some other things. Well, you're picturing these guys going frantically back and forth. So, gee, let's embarrass Virginia Hill. Gee, let's print these papers in Medicare. What if you're not, so what? Do you think he called it that because of this? No, I think he called me that because of the way I do this. So what? And I remember that my main concern, this is when I'm in practice, was that I had my number up high enough I wouldn't be embarrassed in front of my friends. You wanted to have a fairly large number on that website, or your friends might think you're kind of a piker, or you're doing things wrong, or gee, boy, your number was pretty low, man. What's been going on there? I had guys telling me they helped them with their marketing. Well, gee, I think you ought to have this upgrade in your lens. Here's what they say I made. You think I'd sit and argue with you over $2,000-$3,000? I'm a big shot. Just check the newspaper. Printed by the government. You can trust it. Government through the newspaper. It'd just be just like I read it on the internet. That's how I know it's true. So that's not only what I'm worth, but this is what those experts at the government think I'm worth. Look it up. You think I'd argue? Come on. Virginia Hill says, so what? So basically the effect of that, why don't you stick your Sunshine Act where the sun don't shine? That's what that went into. I'm thinking of it on the paper. I am listening to the radio. It wasn't quite the wood-coated one here in the car one time. And things you hear on the radio. This wasn't Virginia Hill, but things you hear on the radio. I hear a guy had been a college professor, and he wanted to hear what radio sounded like. So he went somewhere and did nothing but listen to the radio for like 5 days, for however much. He listened to 12 hours a day of AM radio, which occasionally on the break from surgery when I was first operating and you came out, it's one of those things for the AM radio where I would go out in the surgeon's lounge during a break thing and you'd watch what at that time was soap operas and daytime TV. And I only had about 5 minutes between cases, but you can watch about 5 minutes of that TV and actually feel your brain starting to soften. So this was AM radio at the time. Well, what this professor did was he said on there in kind of a Northeastern accent, I really think that the letters AM must stand for absolute moron, which I thought was pretty funny, but also I thought, I wonder what he thinks FM stands for. So this is just radio stories. I want to illustrate that people think they're having a much bigger effect than they do. We lived in Tokyo. My father worked for Caterpillar Tractor, and we moved around a good deal. We lived in Tokyo for about 3 years, and a big thing was to climb Mount Fuji. Now, Mount Fuji is very holy in the Shinto Buddhism religion, and it's, as mountaineers would find it, it's a cakewalk, but it's not a cakewalk if you're just a guy. I'm 19 years old, and that's a long damn way up there. And what you would do, you went to certain areas. There were shrines at the bottom. It's a religious artifact, and you had maps, and you went to stations up there, and these were a long way apart. You generally walked up there, and you could drive up as high as Station 5, which is where this was. And you think, oh, how bad could this be? It's pretty civilized. And you did kind of a tiring, long walk way up here. I had some people with me and thought, well, and you kind of slide into Station 6 and you're pretty tired. But then you think, well, man, there's 4 or 5 more of these on the way up. It's a long way up. And you hope you'll make it. But then, you have another hike about the same kind. You get up there and you think, well, I'm at 7. I think I'm okay. No, that's 6.1. They start going into decimal at that point, and it is a long down way up the side of Mount Fuji. Now, Japan is the land of the rising sun, so it's regarded as very holy and the best experience to see the sunrise from the top of the mountain. And so what most people do, because you're walking in the pitch dark, they don't have lights up on the side of Mount Fuji at all. That'd be, lights on the side of St. Peter's or something. So the idea is to be at the top when the sun rises. So you are walking in the dark, and the way you get killed on Mount Fuji is you step in the crater. The crater, it's a volcano, of course, and the sides of the crater are sheer. And so, you can go in the crater and you're up there in the dark. What most people do, so they don't have the real long slog in the dark and have to walk that far, is to go to one of the monasteries that are closer to the summit, which this was one. In fact, this is the one I was in. And they're, rather not overly comfortable things, but you sleep all night in there, you get up early, and then you do the last little bit up to the summit and do those things. You carry a walking stick, and at different stations they burn things in your branding iron. You'll have like 30 or 40 of these brands. It's pretty cool with the Japanese characters up there. But the short point of this long story is when you're doing that, we get to the top. It's okay to take some pictures or things. In fact, the Japanese then and now are picture takers. But this is late 60s, early 70s, I think late 60s. And you've got these cameras that I think I've got pictured here. I don't remember the technology at the time very well. And you'd have these little flash cubes, and people are going to take pictures of this beautiful, really landscape that they have. And you could stand to the side of this, and the light of that flash cube will go out about 6-8 feet, and that's it. But these people think that they are lighting up the world, the universe, when they take their little flash bulb thing. And I remember being struck by the irony of that. And with Carl Sagan, the recent book he had, Our Posturings, Our Imagined Self-Importance, the delusion that you're affecting something is still there. So that's the short point of that long story. But you think you're exerting this control over the universe. As you get older, Schopenhauer said, later in life, as you watch some of this, you feel like a person who's sitting behind a row of the carnival booths, watching the tricks they do. But you've seen the tricks happen 4 and 5 and 6 times from behind, and you're aware of this, and they're meant to be seen once quickly from the other side. And it's a big difference, and you feel like all of these things that are clicking behind that, and that is, in fact, as I get older, that's what I've done myself. I wanted to illustrate this government thing with a quote from that jolly jokester Karl Marx, and in fact, he liked this enough, he worked it into his writing about 6 times. And he said this was kind of deep. History really does repeat itself, but as the historian seldom adds, the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. This is a good remark, and it's very, very true. And as you go through your life, you will see, particularly in the professions, some farcical things happen. In my own experience, large groups of people, organizations, governments, tend to go into sort of a collective memory loss, tragedy, farce mode at intervals of about 15 years. It might be 10, it might be 20. And then the phoenix will rise from the ashes of this bad idea, something that was a bad idea to begin with. And I've seen that happen in my own lifetime in certain trends, for instance, to just name one of many. There were intraocular lenses. You have to position them at certain places in the eye, and there's certain places that have been found where it's found to be a bad idea. And you'll go on about another 10 or 12 years, and everybody who's in practice right now hasn't been in practice for a while or isn't talking or isn't trying to keep up. And they'll say, gee, wouldn't it be a good idea if we were to try this? And let's do that. And what happens is you're thinking, kid, we tried that about 10, 15 years ago. It didn't work well at all. And it was this and that, but no one is doing that. The collective memory, the average guy probably works. I've done this I'm stabbing in the dark about 30 years. So you've got a couple of these intervals in there where you have a collective loss of memory. And I like this slide, and I know the print's smaller, but here's the devil rising phoenix-like from the ashes of these bad ideas with lots of money. And gee, let's do this. And this happened a little bit later, and I'll explain why that's in there. Gee, what let's do? We'll have the patients, we'll turn the patients into our own informants. We will encourage people to give these hotlines, these Medicare things, to come into our offices. If they think there's been any kind of Medicare infraction, we'll have all of these hints and tips from actual patients. We won't need to investigate anything. We'll go out there, we'll make you, and it'll have a wonderful atmosphere. We'll make them think their doctor is a criminal and they're just a bunch of crooked guys. We will just be like a certain bunch of secret police, which is the average bureaucrat. That's been his secret dream his whole life. Yes, he's envied the secret police. Think of the climate we'll create, and we'll get all these criminals. Won't that be great? And we'll inform on them, and I could have told them what would happen both times. What you get is après-midi deluge. You are so overwhelmed with real, but occasionally real, but mostly spurious, idiotic, nothing complaints that you have no time to answer the first half hour from your day in the office. And these guys are so overwhelmed, and they're trying to catch up for a month on these great bogus tips that they've had in the, an hour and a half, 2 months ago, as they're trying to work through this backlog of work, that any actual real thing out there is totally going to get washed away in this complete flood. It's predictable, and they're idiots. And here's the guy out there taking notes. Well, I had to wait a long time in the waiting room. That's got to be crooked. Boy, they had a so-and-so. Gee, they won't validate my parking. You'll find it has to be crooked. They need to answer their phone much better. That's got to be something funny. I think they charged me too much, and so they added this on from this and that needs to be investigated. They'll have a complicated thing. I'm not sure where I had my paperwork. They're asking for what they very predictably got. So you have no idea who these people are. Here it is right after the flood. These guys are 2 months into that, and they're working on the first hour and a half of complaints they've had, real and imaginary, from from patients. I mean, I don't want to run down. I'm an old guy myself. I'm not running down old people, but I'm just running down how idiotic that is and how predictably idiotic that is. And they finally got themselves where they're basically lining up the animals 2 by 2 and sailing in their ark while they wait for this whole thing to die down. It's been done before in the history of the work. They wind up high and dry, and their big plan is quietly abandoned as the nonsense that it was to begin with. What you need to remember is on this thing when they're going to do that. I used to have a radar detector in the car, and all any cop ever has to do, they've got the radar guns, they put it on you, and it'll tell them what your speed is, and you have radar detectors to find the patterns of this frequency, and all you have to do with your technology is flip the button on and off, and no radar detector in the world can find your detector. No radar detector can find your radar gun. Your extent of your work is to be able to flip that switch on and off, and you are undefeatable. You also should never forget, therefore, in the final analysis, cops really are bureaucrats, humans. They're not looking to add to their sometimes modest, sometimes back-busting workload, but they're not trying to think up extra things for themselves to do. And this looks like flipping a switch on and off is too much like work, but they're people. They've got to go out and do that. They're no more fond of having their time wasted or listening to nonsense than you are, or I am, or anybody else is. And so that's exactly what that was. I had to wait at least half an hour. They won't validate my parking. I think they charge me this, that. I just don't like them. I wish we could do something about that. And here's Alfonso Bedoya getting set in the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Badges, we don't need no badges. We are the federales. They took the fun out of being a federale. Here he is. I'm not no federale. We don't have no bay. No, I was in practice for a little over 43 years. And this particular brainstorm, as we mentioned the Sunshine Act, that had occurred about 15 years prior to the Sunshine Act. Took about 15 years. And about 15 years after the Sunshine Act came, Sunshine Act had died, its quiet, unlamented death. And about 15 years after that, a new set of masterminds made the same brilliant move. Let's get together, and we're going to get together. We're going to make these patients into a bunch of informants. As our informants, our roving reporter Karl Marx said, It'll begin with a roar, run out of steam less than a month, gone less than 6 months later. This was the farcical stage. It had started as a tragedy and ended as a farce. It was ridiculous. And it had happened before, and it was dumb. And they proved nothing. Nobody ever did. And one day, just a corpse emerging from the water, one day the truth will emerge. The history of meddlesome, intrusive government is the history of unintended consequences. But the short point I'm going to make at the end is if these guys had their way, you'd be at the end. The career bureaucrats and these guys, this is an old knock-knock joke. Knock-knock, who's there? Gestapo. Well, Gestapo who? They'll ask the questions. There's the guy from Raiders of the Lost Ark, but there's the bureaucrat deciding what your fate is. And I'll tell you, one of the things I'm going to go away with this or that, before you go to sleep tonight, get down on your knees and thank God for making you an American. And they did that. God bless America, and God bless that you aren't living under these Nazis, people who are going to tell you what to do. Horrible people. Thank you very much. This is a Bond Report. Please watch more. I'm Dr. William Bond. Thank you very much.